Hi folks, Chuck Black here, author of 52 Weeks of Python, Quokka and quokka-prime, etc. And this is a special lesson that's going to be talking about Docker, which is a container technology. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first explain about Docker, what it is and how it works. And then I'm going to demonstrate taking quokka-prime and running it, certain parts of it anyway, as containers on my system. So without further ado, let's get started. So let's talk about Docker. What is Docker? Well, Docker is a popular container technology. What is a container? Well, let me explain that. Over here on the left, you have basically what your system, your laptop or desktop or whatever looks like. You have hardware, which is the system. You have an operating system running on that. And then you have one or more applications running on top of that operating system. Now, technology such as virtual machines came along and they changed this picture somewhat. So in this situation here with VMs, we have the hardware and we have your operating system, but the application actually running on your operating system is itself an implementation of a virtual machine, and that virtual machine has its own operating system and its own application that can be one or more application running inside that virtual machine. And you can have different operating systems running. So if this was a Windows operating system for my host, this is what we call the host, then the guest virtual machine could be running Ubuntu, it could be running Windows, it could be running Mac, it could be running any of a number of things. But this is the basic virtual machine environment, and that's very popular in data centers and the cloud today. Now, container technology takes a little bit different approach. As you can see, we are not replicating the operating system in each one of these instances, which is called a container. Rather, they're all sharing the same operating system. So, for example, if you are running Ubuntu on a server somewhere in the cloud or in the data center, then all of these different containers would be utilizing that same operating system. But as you can see from this picture, they are all executing in their own space. This is implemented in different ways depending on the underlying technology, operating system technology. But in the Ubuntu world, they would be running in their own namespace. And so each of these things ends up being independent entities that has separation from the others, and it's a lot more lightweight than the virtual machine version that you see in the middle. So just calling these things application may not be helpful. What about a real world example? Well, if you're familiar with quokka-prime, then these entities might be something like, these applications would be something like mongodb, or the quokka-prime server, which is a Flask RESTful service that's running, or all of the monitors or the UIs that we have. So that would be one way that we would break this up, and certainly that's the way that we've built the actual quokka-prime project. So this would be an example of a real-world way that you would separate these different applications and how they would be running in an environment where they're just running on basically bare metal operating system versus running in virtual machines versus running in containers, which is what we're going to look at in this lesson. So we are actually going to be describing something like this, but I want you to be aware of what it really looks like in reality with respect to my own system. And here's a picture of that to give you an idea. I have a laptop. It has its laptop hardware. On top of that is running Windows 10, and on Windows 10 I have a browser open and I'm doing Gmail and MyDrive. I'm also running Camtasia for recording this and for editing it, etc. And I'm running an application called VirtualBox. So VirtualBox is what is allowing me to run this whole thing that you see here. If you've been going through 52 Weeks of Python or any of the quokka-prime from scratch or any of the other stuff, then I'm basically showing you this. And what I'm really showing you is just a single piece of what's running on my laptop. My operating system that I'm running here for software development is Ubuntu, and the example that I'm going to be showing you is going to have Mongo running in a container it will have our quokka-prime server running in a container. And then to keep things as simple as possible and to just make the point of teaching you container fundamentals without going too far into the deep end, I'm going to leave the monitors and the user interface running in their own application state on in this particular virtual machine, my Ubuntu VM. So this is what we're actually looking at, but we will be focusing on this part, so you don't need to be aware of all of the rest of this. Just know that that is how my system is currently running. So let's look at the main components of Docker. Now, if you go to the Docker web pages and elsewhere, you can find lots of stuff to augment what I'm going to tell you. But what I tend to like to do is make things as simple as possible. So what we're going to talk about right now and in the following minutes of this video lesson are going to be two main concepts that exist in Docker. The first one is a Docker image, and the second one is a Docker container. And you need to have these straight in your mind in order to understand what it is that we will be doing and how we're going to make this work. Now, an image basically is the definition of the software that is going to be run. So it will define, in this situation, Mongo database software, what the requirements are for it to run successfully inside a container. For my quokka-prime server, Flask REST software that's going to be running in this container, then it's going to be a definition of the Python environment that we're going to define in which we will be running this software, this Flask software plus the software plus that I've added, plus any of the extra stuff that we need to add to it. So that is what the image is all about. In the case of Mongo, I'm not going to have to create that image because images already exist up in the cloud for Mongo and for Postgres and for Java and for a bunch of other stuff, including Python. We will be benefiting from that as well. For the quokka-prime Flask REST service, I'm going to have to define how that is going to get created, and I do that in the creation of the image. There's something called a Docker file, and that is going to be what defines the software that will be run. Now, when I want to run it, I'm going to be running it in a container. So basically, the container is going to define the execution environment for that image. So when I create a container, it will be linked to a particular image, and I will define certain things that allow other processes to communicate with my container. It will allow me to store data, etc. So the container is the unit of execution, or the thing that gets run. The image is the definition of the software, and that is the main components, that are the main concepts of Docker. Now, there are other things such as networking and volumes and things of that nature. We're not going to worry about that right now. We're going to keep it as simple as possible. So now that you understand about images and containers, let's talk about them in a little bit more detail. So the first thing is we are going to build an image. With a container, we're going to run the container. So let's look at what it means to build an image. What we're going to do is we're going to specify this thing called a Docker file. And the Docker file is going to specify to Docker the details about the image that I'm going to build. One example would be that I'm going to reference the base image it's going to be built from. So when I build my quokka-prime server, I'm going to say, hey, I want as a base the Python image, and I'm going to build my software on top of that image. So basically, I'm going to create an image, but it's going to have a base image that's based on Python. So that is the Python part of it, but I'm going to have my own part as well, which is the quokka-prime server stuff. And in there, I'm going to be specifying the directory, in other words, my files from which the image is going to be built. That will be my quokka-prime server directory. And so that's what I will be referencing. And as I mentioned, for Python as an example, we're going to build it from an existing Python image. And then in addition to that, what I need to do is I need to specify my requirements.txt file. This is the file that we use in real software development for Python where we articulate all of the different packages that we are going to use in my application. So I'm going to be referencing things like Flask. I'm going to be referencing things like Scapy, things of that nature that need to be loaded in order for my container, my quokka-prime server to run in a container. I need to let Docker know about all of that stuff. That is how my image gets built. The container I'm going to run it, and that is going to perform two steps actually. It's going to do a create. So it's going to create the container, and then it's going to start it. So this is just a convenience action that we can take when we do a run. It does these two things. I can do them independently, but typically we will do a run, and then later on we will stop it, and then we can later start it and stop it and start it, etc. But that is basically what it is. My container, when I run the container or when I create the container, I am going to create it using an image, which I'm going to reference. So when I'm running Mongo, I'm going to reference the Mongo image, which is going to get pulled down from the cloud. When I'm running my own image, then like for quokka-prime server, then I'm going to be referencing that. One thing I'll point out that I do is I do attach output to the terminal. You can run it in detached mode, in which case it just runs in the background. You can also run it and say attach the output to my terminal, and that actually is what's going on right here. As you can see, my output looks just like it does when I'm just running the Flask quokka-prime server application, but in this situation it's actually running inside a Docker container. Okay, so let's drill down into a little bit more detail about each of these and how we're going to be doing them in our environment with quokka-prime running. So the first one we're going to talk about is Mongo. As I mentioned, I do not need to build an image for Mongo because there's already an existing Mongo image that is out there that I can just benefit from. So it already exists. All I need to do is reference it. And this is the command that I'm using. This command is actually one line, but I ran out of room, so pardon my splitting it into two lines here. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to say sudo docker. Docker needs to run in super user mode. You can, of course, if you understand Ubuntu, set it up so that you don't need to do sudo all the time, but I'm going to be doing sudo in all of these cases. So I'm going to say sudo docker run. Remember what run does? It does a create and start. That's what I mentioned down here. Now the next thing I'll mention is that I do -p27017. Those are the ports. That is the port that Mongo listens on by default. So I need to tell the container, hey, you need to let traffic on port 27017 come through, and it will do that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to specify the name of this container. Now could be anything that I want. I'm going to call it quokka-prime Mongo, but you can choose whatever name you want. This is just your own choice. And the last thing, it's a little bit confusing in the command line because there's not a specific attribute or parameter that you pass it. It's just the actual thing that you are going to be building this container from. It's the image, and that is this last thing that you see here, Mongo. So this is going to say to Docker, I want you to build this container using the Mongo image, and we'll see how we do this when we do the quokka-prime server in just a second. So I'm telling it to use the Mongo image that exists out in the cloud, and it will pull it down. It will create this container, and then remember it's doing a create and start. It will begin to run it. So that's what this command does, and that's how I start Mongo. Now doing the quokka-prime server is a little bit different because we will have to build the image ourselves. Now I'm not going into the Docker file here. There's a fair amount of stuff that I will go through when I demonstrate this to you, but the basic idea is that we will be doing a Docker build in order to build our image. This tag is just the name that we're going to give it, And this is really important. Don't be like me and forget this every other time. This dot is telling Docker that I want you to build the image from the directory that I'm currently in. As you probably know, in Ubuntu or Linux systems, a dot means the current directory. And so I'm doing this from the quokka-prime directory, and that's where it is actually building it. So that allows me to build the image. The second step, of course, is to run it, and that is going to do, as you know, a create and start. So I'm using the docker run command. I'm going to be passing in a couple of things. This Python buffered equals 1 allows output from Python to come to the terminal. This right here, that's an environment variable. This is also an environment variable, and this is what I've defined myself. And there's an environment variable called Mongo, and that is going to be the IP address and the port on which the quokka-prime server is going to use in order to communicate with Mongo. So that is what that information is. Now, the last two things we had talked about before, the name is going to be the name that I'm going to give this particular container, which is going to be quokka-prime server. And then the last thing is the actual image name. And you can, whatever you named up here is what you will reference down here. Quokka-prime server image is what I have defined when I gave it that tag. So that allows me to both build the image and then run the container. Once the container is run, I can then do a stop of the container, and then I can start it later on because the containers do stay around. But that is how I will build and I will run or create and start my quokka-prime server container. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is communication. That is communicating from outside a container into a container, or from one container to the other. And you may be wondering to yourself, well, how do they do this? Is there something special that's going to go on? And the answer is not really anything special going on. So, for example, in order to communicate with my Mongo container, which I'm going to be doing from quokka-prime, all I really need to do is specify the IP address of the Mongo container. So this is going to have an IP address which I can find and I can use, and then the port that I'm going to communicate with it on. And from that point forward, it's just normal Mongo communication. So really, IP address and port, just like if it was on a different system, that's what I'm going to be using to communicate. In the same way, communicating with the quokka-prime server container that is running, how do I do that? And I'll do that from the monitors or from the UI, as you can see up there and over here on the left. How do I do that? Well, all I really need to do is specify the IP address of the quokka-prime server and then the port. And as you probably know, I'm using port 5001. So I didn't really need to change much of anything in my code. I needed to allow my code to specify Mongo that was at a different IP address, but that was pretty straightforward. And then communication here, I already had the ability to specify an IP address of the quokka-prime server from my monitors or from my display. And so that is what we do in order to communicate. It's just exactly the same as communication in any other domain, whether it's across on the same system or different systems, whatever. You use the IP address and port, and voila, it works just like magic. Okay, so let's remind ourselves what we're doing here. We have Mongo running in its own container. We have the quokka-prime server, which is the Flask REST API thing, running in its own container. And we will be running the monitors and the UIs straight on the Ubuntu system that we've been doing stuff on normally before. So that is what we're going to be doing. Now, I have that up and running actually right now. I can show that to you by doing a sudo docker ps. That's ps just like a command in Ubuntu to show the processes that are running, except this is going to show the Docker processes that are running. And you can see I have two containers running. My first container is using the image quokka-prime server. We're actually going to be creating that. We'll probably name it quokka-prime server image when we do it again in the demonstration that I'm going to do. And this is some information about it. I've given it the name quokka-prime server. And then the second thing, the image is Mongo. Remember, Mongo, I'm not building that image myself, but we're using the one that is stored up in the cloud by the Docker folks, and I'm just running it. I have no idea what this command is to run it, and it is up and running on this port right here that we talked about. And so that's what's up and running. If I was to look at this and say, hey, what's really going on? Well, if you're familiar with quokka-prime, then you're familiar with what this server output looks like. I'm basically getting put requests, get requests, etc., and servicing those. The user interface is going to that service, and it is getting the information and printing it out, and you can see that it's doing that right here. Every time this gets down to 0, then you should see a new GET request show up right here. And whoops, it happened to coincide with the actual thing that's going on with my monitors, which is this thing right here. This has all my monitors for device and service and hosts running, and it's monitoring all of those things in the network, and it's updating things, and you can see stuff keeps getting added over and over again. So it's up and running. What we're going to do is we're going to bring it down, and then we are going to build it from scratch. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop my Docker containers from running. And the way that I do that, I do sudo docker stop quokka-prime server. What you should see over here, kind of in the corner, is it eventually is going to stop. And you can see right here that indeed it has stopped running. So that's good, and it's telling me that it has stopped. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stop Mongo from running. And as you can see, here's the name of this particular container. So I'm going to say quokka-prime Mongo. And it has now stopped Mongo. So what you should see is this is no longer going to succeed in doing anything. You'll see a lot of errors because it's trying to get information and it's not able to do that. And up here in my user, the GUI for, I think I was showing hosts, yeah, it's going to end up not being able to get anything, so it shows nothing. So those are now both stopped. So what I want to do now is I want to remove both containers that I've created and also the image that I've created. So the way that I do this is I do sudo docker container rm quokka-prime server. So now it has deleted quokka-prime server, and I'm going to also do the same thing for quokka-prime Mongo. So now I've gotten rid of both of those. Now that I've gotten rid of the container, I can get rid of the image of quokka-prime server. So I can come back, I'll use the same rm command, but I'm going to do image. And so now it has deleted that one, and I'm no longer able to start it, either the Mongo or the quokka-prime server. So we're going to have to go through the build process. Okay, so let's build our containers and our image. So here I am, I'm in the quokka-prime directory. That's because that's where all my code is located. As you can see, I've got my server code and my monitor code and my UI code. Now I'm just going to be building server functionality into this particular image, but I'm going to build everything from the base quokka-prime directory. Now important in here is this thing called a Docker file. By default, this capital D Docker file is what Docker is going to use when I try to build the image. So let me show you what it looks like. So here is the Docker file. The first thing that you can see is that this is going to be built from this Python image. So it's going to use Python 3.8 Slim Buster as its base image. I'm saying my working directory is where I am right now, quokka-prime. I'm going to copy the requirements.txt file that you see up here. I'm going to use that for my requirements.txt as I build stuff. And this is the command that I use to build my environment. So this is going to do a pip3 install of everything that's in my requirements.txt file, which we'll look at in just a minute. That basically lists all of the packages and their versions that are going to get pulled down and installed into my image and containers environment. Then I'm doing a copy. I'm basically copying from the directory that I'm in into my container. That's what this is telling me with these two dots. And then the command that it's going to run when everything is done is this thing right here, which is a file that I created, a script called run quokka, which is, you can see up here, run quokka.sh is right there. So let's take a look at requirements. Now, you need to understand a little bit about this. You can look up what requirements.txt is all about. I'm not going to go through a detailed description of that, but basically you do a pip freeze, F-R-E-E-Z-E, and it will output all of the packages that are loaded as well as the version number. Now the ones that have a pound sign, I've commented out because I know that I don't need those. At one point in time, the ones that you see without a hashtag in front of it or a pound sign, I did feel that I needed. I don't need all of them at this point in time, but I definitely need all of the Flask stuff. Probably HTTP lib 2 may be required as well. I don't know if JSON schema gets loaded or not. Basically, this is going to be loading a bunch of stuff, and I left in things like NetMiko and NetAdder and things that I might use for doing monitors, so I left those uncommented. But that is what's going to get used in order to build my image. And so, yeah, let's see. If I look in my Docker file, that's what my requirements.txt is all about. And then run quokka.sh, let's look at that. Run quokka.sh just has a number of commands. It's going to change my directory to server. I'm going to set my Python path to dot. I'm going to export the environment variable called Flask app, and that is my Quokka server program. And then I'm going to do Flask run with these parameters. This is exactly what we've done before. The difference is it's going to be running in a container. Now, in order to build this, I'm going to be utilizing the Docker build command, and I'm going to do a history here, and I'm going to grep for Docker build, and you'll see all the times that I've done Docker build. So here is the most recent one that I've done. Basically, I'm going to say sudo docker build. I'm going to give it a name, Quokka server image, and then I'm going to say build it from this local spot here. So let me type that in. Okay, and now it is going out and it's beginning to build my image. It's going to actually be installing stuff. It's creating all of the image that is going to be used when this container is run. You can see it's giving information about the build status, how many seconds, what step it's in. I think 12 of 13. It's doing copy ... Okay, so now I have this quokka-prime server image that I've actually built. So the next thing that I can do is I can move on to actually starting the container with this in it. Now, before I actually start or run that container, what I want to do is get my Mongo up and running. And so the command that I use, you can see that there's a couple of situations in my history where I've actually run it. It's the same every time. Remember, this is pulling it from the cloud, and the name is the name that I am giving it right here. I could call it whatever I wanted. And I do my run statement. Minus D means detached. Minus P means I'm specifying the port, and this is the port that I'm going to be using. So I'm going to type that in right now and get it started. Remember, this last Mongo is the actual name of the source for the image, and that is going to come from up wherever Docker keeps its repository of such things. And then this is the name that I'm going to give it. I didn't have to build this image. It's already up there. So there it gave me this long identifier telling me the name of the image, and that is up and running. If I was to do a sudo docker ps, I can see that Mongo is up there. It was created 13 seconds ago. It's been up for 12 seconds. That makes sense. And the name that I gave it is quokka-prime Mongo. So that's good. Now what I can do is I can start my own quokka-prime server container. And so once again, I'm going to look at the history where I went through and did this before, and I'm going to grep for docker run. And here are some examples of this. Now remember, I named my image quokka-prime server image, and so I'm going to need to remember that I did that when I type this in. As just going over this, I said sudo docker run, so this is going to do a run. I'm passing in this environment variable of Python buffered equals 1. For me, for my own purposes, I'm passing in the IP address and port of Mongo, and you can see if you have an eagle eye, that didn't work, did it? Because I typed in the wrong port number. This is the one that I should be typing in, and that is the standard Mongo port number. So let me try to type this in. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this one. It's the easier way to do it. And I'm going to paste it. Now the name of my image is quokka-prime server image. I believe that's what I called it. So let's see if this works. So at this point you can see that I'm getting the output that I normally get when we run Quokka server, so that's good. I can see that I'm talking to the correct Mongo, and that's good, and that I have the URL with the IP address that's appropriate, getting GET requests. And so what I need to do at this point is I'm running the monitors again, and you can see the output is looking pretty good, both in terms of what I'm seeing on the screen here as well as the one above it, which is where the service is running. So it looks like things are working out well. So I probably want to show you a little bit about what it's like when it's running and what changes I had to make. You can see right here inside the container, remember we're running the quokka-prime server inside a container, and that's happening right here. You can see everything's going well. Right here you can see the monitoring is going on. Let me show you what I need to do in order to run that. First I'm going to stop it. So I'm going to say stop monitors. And now my monitoring has stopped, and so let me show you what I needed to do with run monitors. What I'm doing is I'm passing in the IP address of the Quokka server and the port number. So I didn't have that originally in run monitors. If I was to go back and show us run monitors, I'll say cat run monitors.sh. You can see I'm taking the first parameter. By default, it's localhost 5001. So if you've seen me not using anything before, that's what the default is. But it is going to use this Quokka when it runs the monitor and the port scan and the device monitor and the service monitor. So when I run that, this is what it looks like. I have this appended at the end as the parameter that I pass in. And when I do that, It launches all of these things, scans for the host, which it does at the beginning and then periodically, and you can see it's doing the services, etc. Now for running the user interface, let's take a look at that. Here I only need to do Control C. If you look at what I ran, you can see I'm doing it exactly as I did before, except I'm passing in an actual parameter, and I'm doing that because this is actually a Python program, and I'm passing in this quokka parameter, which is passing in the IP address and the port for the Quokka server, which is running here, remember, inside the container. So the connectivity is going to be using quokka-prime IP address 5001 because that is what we're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and let this start again. And just for grins, I'm going to do the same thing for services. As you can see, here's my command. I've got to pass in where Quokka is, otherwise it will do it localhost. And that is my services display. And for devices, it's the similar thing where I need to pass in this quokka parameter with the IP address of where my Quokka server is running inside the container. So there you see the user interfaces. They're doing their gets from the container, and everything is looking hunky-dory. So before we're done, I wanted to go over a couple things that are useful from a command line perspective. So one thing I can do in order to see what containers are up and running is I can say sudo docker ps. And what ps will do is it shows me the running processes, just like a normal Linux type command. It lists the processes. So here I can see that the image from quokka-prime server image is running. That's the command that it's running. The name that I gave it, the name of this container is quokka-prime server. The name of my other container is quokka-prime mongo, and that is built from this image called mongo, which it came from the cloud. Now some other commands that I can do, I can say sudo docker image ls-a. Now this is ls, just like in a Linux command to list the images. I need to do -a, or I typically do -a because it shows them to me whether they are running or not. So I'm going to list all of my images. You can see in my own repository now I have the one that I created, my quokka-prime server image, and also it has pulled down this Mongo image, so I have that up and running. And you can see mine was created 6 days ago, which is when I recorded the thing that you probably saw. The Mongo image that I got is from only 3 weeks ago, so that came down onto my system about 3 weeks ago when I first started to do this. So this is showing you my images. Now I can do the same command, except not for images, but for containers. So here, if I do container, it's showing me my containers. This is similar to what the running process was showing me, but if they're even not running, then it will show them to me because I do ls-a. Now, I do want you to know, once you've done this, you can stop these containers from running and then restart them again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do sudo docker stop, and then I give the name of my container. I'm going to stop quokka-prime server from running right now, and this is going to go out, and it will actually, you'll see here that it has actually stopped running. So my quokka-prime stop, it has actually stopped successfully, so that's good. And what you should see down here is that my retrieving of services is taking a long time. That's because it's actually going to fail. And I actually have some scan results attempting, which are actually operating. Every time I try to connect with the server, though, here I'm retrieving hosts. These are all my monitors that are running. Every time it tries to communicate with it, because as you can see, it's no longer running, that is actually going to fail. Now I'm doing services, hosts, devices. These are all actually timing out. And eventually, if we wait long enough, then we'll see some error messages start to come up that indicate that a problem has been encountered and it didn't get any information back. Okay, so here's an exception from the REST API. Max retries with the devices, so I got that error coming back. And you can see I got a similar error with hosts, etc. So my monitors are failing, and if we look up here, then we can see that this is not running, so my stop has successfully run. Now, if I was to do sudo docker ps, this is one reason I wanted to show you this. Now you can see there is only one of these things running, and that's Mongo. Mongo is up and running still, but not my quokka-prime server. If I do sudo docker container ls, and I didn't specify -a like I did before, it shows me only the one that's running. And I'm not sure why they did it that way, but if I want to see both of them, then I do ls -a. And let's see, this needs to be made a little bit wider so that I can see all of it. And here you can see that my run quokka, that it exited about a minute ago. That's why I needed to make the screen wider to be able to see that. So here we can see that quokka-prime server is there. The same thing, I believe, with images. Let me do sudo docker image ls. No, the image is still there, so I don't have to do -a for the sudo docker image, just for the container. Now let's go ahead and start that thing again. I'm going to go find my command, and I'm going to say start. Now I've started it, and it's actually going to be up and running. And actually what I haven't done in this situation is I haven't attached the output. So let me just be clear about this. What I did here, remember, was I did a sudo docker run, and that's why I was getting all of this information printed out to the screen. When I do a sudo docker start, I'm not actually going to see the output unless I attach the output to this terminal window. So here you can see things are starting to work again, and my user interface is starting to look like it should once more. Whoops, that's not the one I wanted. So now everything's running again. Let me show you what I would do if I wanted to actually see the output, because I'm not seeing my output from the server like I did before because I didn't attach it. So let me show you how to do that. I'm going to stop it first of all. So I'm going to stop the quokka-prime server, and the quokka-prime server is taking a while to stop because the code that I have in there, in order to support a graceful shutdown, it actually has a 15-second pause in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my sudo docker start from here, but I'm going to do the attach keyword. And actually, yeah, let's see if I sudo docker start quokka-prime server. That's what I want to do, but I'm going to do --attach. And I can't even remember if this is the right command. So let's see if this works. I did do it correctly. So here you can see my quokka-prime server is beginning to print stuff out like we normally expect it to do. So you can see it's printing out my GET requests. It's here's this thing where it says it was running with Mongo, this Mongo right there that you can see. Okay, let's review what we did in this lesson. The first thing we did was we showed you that we had it up and running with Mongo and quokka-prime server running in containers. Then we stopped them and we deleted the image and the containers, and then we built it up again. And the way that we built it, with Mongo, we pulled down the Mongo image from the cloud and we built the container and started that. With quokka-prime server, what we had to do is we had to specify a Docker file and requirements.txt in order to build a Python-based image that would run our service, our web service that is running quokka-prime server. And then we referenced that image when we created our container, and we started that container by doing a run command, which did a create and a run. Then we started our monitors and our UIs running. Now for communication, we had to make some changes. For communication between Mongo and our quokka-prime server, we had to pass in the Mongo IP address, which was something that probably we should do anyway. And then for the monitors and the UIs, we had also to augment those applications to take as input the quokka-prime server IP address and port. And so the end result is we have that working. We have, here's the user interface for the hosts. Here's the user interface for the services. And here is the user interface for the devices. So that's Docker. Hopefully it made sense. You understand what it is, how it works, how I got it to work with quokka-prime. As always, if you have any questions, just let me know. And thanks for listening.